welcome everybody to this really quite special interview with Kim Moody. I'm Unjum Mirza, a member of Counterfire and also a member of ASLEF, the Train Drivers Union, proudly organising to support solidarity action for the national rail strike taking place at this moment in time. Kim is a lifelong socialist, founding member of Labour Notes, author of many books, and now teaching in London, residing in London, member of both the UCU union and the NUJ. And today we're going to be looking at a new book just published by Kim, which I think is really a very important book and a major contribution to a critical debate in the US at this moment in time. Breaking the Impasse, electoral politics, mass action, and the new socialist movement in the United States. I do think this, I do recommend this is read with Kim's previous book on New Terrain, which goes into a deeper assessment of Kim's assessment of capitalism, analysis of capitalism today as well. The two books really tie in really well together. So firstly, welcome, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here. And good work on a rail strike there.
Thank you, Kim. So the first thing really to ask and look at here is exactly what do you mean by what you describe as the impasse in the US? You know, what you call the gridlock, or what Mike Davis calls the trench warfare at the moment in the US. If you can expand on that.
Right. Well, what I mean is more than just the legislative gridlock, which has been there for a while. When I'm talking about the impasse, is that what I mean is that it's become impossible for just about any government to implement any kind of deep reforms and so forth for a long time. Anything comparable, say, even to the 60s, as relatively weak as that was. And I believe the reasons for that lie in the crisis of the system, the multiple crises of the system, not only the continuing economic ups and downs and the crises and all the things we see now in terms of inflation, the return of inflation and all of that, but the climate change crisis, the crisis of racism in the United States, even mass killings and things of that sort. That the political parties and the Democrats, who are usually the party of reform, so far as there's any kind of reform, even in the context of a capitalist society, become incapable of doing, and that really goes back to the 70s and to changes that took place in the Democratic Party, but more importantly in the way that big capital addressed politics, electoral politics themselves. That is what I'm talking about here is the huge entrance of money. It's always been there, of course, but the escalation of that. So now that elections are multi-billion-dollar affairs and so forth, most of the money that gets into elections today comes from capitalists. And even since I wrote the book, actually, during these midterms, you can see that individual capitalists are themselves putting in hundreds of millions to stop even mildly left-wing candidates from getting anywhere in today's primaries. And this whole intervention of capital in a more direct way than perhaps was true in the past is part of that. but again, also the inability to deal with the constantly recurring crises of capitalism, the slowing down of capitalism globally, not only in the United States in terms of investment and things of that sort. The massive inequality that capitalism has produced throughout, but also in the advanced countries, in the United States and UK in particular, as you know, as extreme as that, because these parties and their office holders and the structures of the parties, the institutions of the party, have become so dependent on not only corporate money, but increasingly the money of wealthy individuals. There's a part in one of the chapters where I go through the changes that have taken place in the capitalist class, personnel changes, you might say, you know, the industry changes, the kind of corporations that used to fund politics, like say General Motors, the big wealth board, and the big well-known corporations, they're kind of down the list now. And what list are private equity and the sort of financial bottom feeders of Wall Street, the high-tech companies, of course, Amazon and all, Google and all that. You know, it's a new kind of development in the capitalist class where a growing number of individuals have so much money that, you know, they can throw countless amounts at elections, and that's part of the reason. The other reason, of course, is that ideologically the Democrats have never gone beyond liberal reform. I mean, even at the height of the New Deal in the 30s, it never in any way challenged capitalism. It's never even been a social democratic party in the sense of, say, the British Labour Party or the European social democratic parties. And what that has meant is that as the Republicans has moved farther and farther to the right, the Democrats have responded to this by moving farther and farther to the center, and in some senses even to the right. And so what this means is that it's become impossible, not only at the level of the federal government, but in many states, you know, for the current political forces to make any kind of progress in dealing with these multiple capitalism, whether it's the climate change, the state of the economy, the double inequality, you know, and of course now the growing international problems that U.S. imperialism faces and so forth. So I think, you know, that's what I mean by the impasse. And the hope that a lot of people had that could be broken really centered around the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016, when it looked like, you know, I don't think, I never believed he could win, but, you know, it looked like here was a self-proclaimed democratic socialist, a social democrat, running in the Democratic primary, doing very well, actually, in the 2016 thing and so forth. That kind of spurred a resurgence of the left. And so the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a moribund organization of really social democratically minded middle class people and so forth, aging kind of organization, all of a sudden it became the vehicle for thousands, literally thousands of young people to join this and to identify as socialists. What that's all kind of vague what they meant by it. You know, you and I might have a sort of clear idea about revolutionary socialism, but this was not. Some people had that point of view. And for many, it was just an electoral view, like European social democracy or something. For many others, it was just a way of expressing their activism in unions or in tenant organizing, a lot of tenant organizing, or in the various movements that sprang up in the last really 10 to 20 years, Black Lives Matter or whatever. So the DSA became rapidly, almost overnight, an organization that hit about 90 to 95,000 members. There had not been anything like that in the United States for generations. So this was a spectacular thing. The problem, of course, was that it had no real political definition at core. So it is today an organization that is very much divided among different caucuses and tendencies and so forth. But what it did have, and this is the problem with it, because of the Sanders thing, it saw electoral politics as an open. I mean, many of the people in it, when I'm saying it, of course, we're talking about tens of thousands of people. They don't all agree with this, with the electoral orientation at all necessarily. But those who kind of set the tone for the organization, set its convention resolutions and things like that, the organized caucuses do tend to look at this Sanders thing. And on some congressional elections, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and so forth in 2018, it looked like to many people there would be some kind of opening, And many of us who came out of the revolutionary left from various different versions of it even, said, well, wait a minute, this party, it isn't just something you win a primary election and then influence. It's an institution, it has structures, it has power structures, it's backed by capital and in huge amounts, but people didn't all agree with that, or even ones do somehow, think you can break through this thing. Well, okay, the impasse has now been imposed on DSA, on the Democratic Socialists of America itself. In reality, growth virtually stopped year or so, and in fact, they've begun losing dues-paying members. So that this organization that looked like it was going to be this, some of this has happened since I actually wrote the book, but I think you can see in the book why this might have happened. This running in Democratic primaries with the idea of changing this party, when in fact the party was not changing. That yes, its programs are a little bigger and more expensive, but then so were Trump's. Everybody's spending more money, but it's not going to the majority of people. It's going to capital in one way or another. And even reforms like taxing the wealthy and these things are despite discussions of it, are beyond the pale for the Democrats. So all of a sudden there is a halt in the growth, of the left, as well as the impasse of bourgeois politics. There's also now an impasse in the politics of the left itself. And I think, that is a result in large part, not only, but in large part of this focus on working in elections, particularly through the Democratic Party. And I tried to argue in the book about why it doesn't have to be that way and why that won't work and so forth. But now it's become a serious problem, and that has meant more and more internal infighting in DSA. Naturally, when a group is running up against the wall, the internal fights get more severe, and that's already happening there. So the main, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, in terms of that dynamic, obviously there's always a gap between you writing, the book being published, and of course a number of things that happen, Roe versus Wade, of course the Ukraine war, and AOC and the DSA delegates, of course, supporting Biden's request for the 40 billion for military and financial aid for Ukraine. All these things really kind of reinforce and confirm your assessment here. and it kind of that strategic orientation towards electoralism. There's a fascinating chapter on the dynamic of the upward and rightward shift within the DSA. Could you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, well, this is historically what has happened before. This is, by the way, not the first time that people who identify as socialists have run as Democrats and served in Congress. John Conyers and so forth, who were DSA members for most of their careers and so forth, even took on powerful committee chairs, and yet unable to ever, pass any of the more radical legislation that they personally might have liked, and because they're an example of how the party. One of the things about the Democratic Party is that it has a long history of absorbing people from the left. It's kind of almost the opposite of what Starmer and these people did to Corbyn, which is just a unbelievable smashing of the Labor Party and so forth. The Democrats, partly because the so-called left of the Democratic Party has always been very small and weak, but this to bring you in, put you on a committee, not try to necessarily destroy your career or anything like that. And by drawing you into the whole complicated process of legislation and parliamentary ways of doing things and so forth, to socialize you, so to speak. And if you go too far, then you can get slapped down and you get put on the wrong committee or something like that. So it's the carrot and the stick thing. And they've used a lot of carrot things to bring in Bernie Sanders into the Biden administration, to bring in the so-called squad, the 4 women of color who won in 2018, and a couple of others have been, kind of brought into the fold. And if you had looked at the whole debates around Biden's Build Back Better program and all of that, you would see what happened in the end is that these self-identified socialists end up being the best defenders of the remnants of his not very good program. So there they are doing what even the normal Democrats don't do very well. So they're totally absorbed into it, and that is a age-old process in the Democratic Party, and they're still very good at doing that. And that is where right now, that is basically where the squad and the small number of about 6 elected people, maybe 3 of them who identify as DSA members, as socialists and so forth, or maybe 4, and a couple of more that have been elected in the primaries now. They just get pulled into this long process because, after all, the Republicans are so bad that it's easy for the Democrats to say, well, wait a minute, you can't undermine our program, and our action, because you're just giving it to the Republicans. And so it's been like that for a long time. That is the process of, in this case, they haven't really elevated people in a formal sense, but they have brought them into the leadership discussions and so forth. And Bernie Sanders is the head of the Finance Committee. This is one of the most powerful committees in the U.S. Congress, and yet he can't get anything done. But they've made him, part of the power structure, powerless part of the powers, and that's the way it works. It's a long-standing, very sophisticated way of handling people, and so that won't change. That will go on, and that's one of the things we're saying to people. If you keep running people the Democratic Party, you're just going to lose them. And they've had a lot of things. I don't know if you've seen any of this, but some of the people who have taken office as Democrats, not only in Congress, but in city councils, and have broken over key policies that DSA has, notably on the question of military support for Israel and questions like that. They've broken with the DSA position on that. So that creates an internal thing in DSA, but it also demonstrates the fact that, well, yes, the Democratic Party has always been totally committed to the state of Israel, as is, and almost no matter what it does to the Palestinians and so forth. And if you're going to be in that party and you're going to try to be, opposed to Israel policy and all of this and pro-Palestinian, and they do have that problem. So these things come up, and that's what the people who coined that term. I didn't actually coin it, but the ones who termed that, they were aware of this, even though they're in favor of this electoralism. Very strange to me, but
yeah,
it's a process that always happens. And so what I've tried to do in the book, I think the main theme, if you looked at it, is the antidote to this stuff can't be just in running more socialists for office, particularly in the Democratic Party. It's going to have to come from mass movements. It's going to have to be the kind of disruptive mass movements that existed in capitalist history worldwide, of course, but even in the United States. And it's when those movements become so disruptive to society that even the mainstream parties have to make some concessions to the movements and to the majority of people. They may be very mild, concessions, but they have to make some concessions. Well, they haven't made any concessions for half a century or more. That's the impasse. So how to break the impasse? It has to come from below, and that, of course, gets us into the discussion of the social movements as well as the trade unions and what's happening there.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's brilliant, because it leads on to the obvious question. I mean, it's brilliant through the book how you assess historically those social movements and trade union movements and the strike movements, 1930s, and the birth of the CIO, the civil rights movement. Of course, you don't do it in a nostalgic way. You assess the strengths, limitations, and weaknesses. And of course, the struggle today as well, the obvious would be the Chicago teachers, but recently the recognition rights in Amazon and Starbucks. I noticed today the pilots in Dallas protesting about being overworked, understaffed. But also what you do. So if you can say a bit about that, the struggle itself and the important uptick that's taking place at this moment in time. But also, again, you've got, I certainly kind of agree with this, a very important assessment and analysis of Jane McAlevey and her approach to trade union organizing, as opposed to a top-down professional organizers. You're very much from below again in terms of workers' self-activity and the rank and file. Sorry, if you want to expand on that.
Speaking of Jane McAlevey and that approach, I think her approach goes back several years, and it precedes what's going on right now. And my problem, she has a lot of good tactical ideas. There's no doubt about that. And not all of them are brand new or anything like that. Some of them she has an interesting twist on and those things. But I think there are a number of problems with, the way she approaches it. First is that everything she argues for is in the context of the existing industrial relations legal setup, the National Labor Relations Board and all that. Now, she isn't necessarily praising that or anything like that, but I think she accepts that whole framework. And what we know about that framework is that it's totally useless. It favors the employers, and it has been far from being what it's supposed to be, a way for people to get unionized. It's become a way to make it harder for particularly people in large units. And so I think that's the first problem. The second problem is that she sees it, as you mentioned, the vantage point of being a professional organizer. She's actually very militant about this, that you aren't an organizer unless you are trained in the proper method of organizing, which she sees as coming out of the Communist Party in the 30s and 40s and so forth. I think a flawed understanding of what they did, but nonetheless, that's her view. She has an idealized view, particularly of the Health Workers Union 1199, which is actually now it's a shambles, but it was always a bureaucratic union like other unions. Yes, it had a left thing, on civil rights and a number of good things that it did. But its model of organizing was not really fundamentally different from anybody else's, any other unions. And that is the old idea. You send out these professional organizers and you don't go after what she calls, and in the lingo of organizers, the hot shops. And a hot shop is where some people, let's say from Amazon, call up your union and say, come and help us. Now, okay, you could do that. That's the old way. But she says, well, see, that doesn't work. What you need is a strategy for each, you have to pick out the industries you think you can do. And this is what the union she was in, the SEIU, so the Service Employees International Union, which is the most bureaucratic in the United States. I mean, its local unions involve 4 or 5 states in some cases. Imagine trying to have a meeting of a branch of your union that involves that kind of geography, larger than the whole of the British Isles. But never mind. She sees it from this vantage point of the professional organizer. And what I tried to do using the example of both the civil rights movement and the CIO is that, well, in fact, when something really big happens, it didn't happen because there were professional organizers. In the early 30s, when the upsurge started, it was the workers that did it. In fact, the professional organizers sent in by the AFL, the old unions at the time, tried to stop all the strikes. Fortunately, the workers ignored them and went past them. So there's never been a period of growth of unions in the United States that was done in the way she's advocating. Never. It comes from below, it comes from the workers themselves, or by and large, it doesn't happen. You can't grow the trade union movement, election by election. Plus which I think the whole approach of union organizing being turned into an election is a mistake. Because union organizing isn't about votes, it's about power. And if you aren't exercising and organizing for power, you're not going to win. And that's why the Alabama thing at Amazon lost and looks like it's going to lose again. And why, on the other hand, although they did go for an election in New York, the ALU, the Amazon Labor Union, they had done their work in the first place. They had been conducting actions. They had been organizing people face to face, and there were no professional organizers at all involved in that. It was just the workers themselves that did it. And that's what's new in the last, well, sort of beginning with the teacher up, they were, most of the teachers who did the strikes initially in West Virginia weren't even members of the unions. The 2 unions of teachers in West Virginia were, minority unions that really hadn't done much of anything and played almost no role in the strikes whatsoever. So again, that was an example of, people taking this and building it on a statewide basis in a basically conservative state, an amazing thing if you think about it, and doing this themselves. And they inspired, of course, all the things that followed after that. And they were in turn inspired. You mentioned the Chicago teachers going back over a decade now, to where that began. That was a rank and file movement too. There were no professional organizers involved in taking over, kicking out the old guard and taking over that union. But McAlevey doesn't quite see that. And in fact, she gives one example in the whole thing of the Latino immigrant organizers in an important meatpacking plant in the South that went ahead and did that. And she kind of, you can almost get in the tone, she's amazed at the skills that these Latin American workers, immigrant workers, had in organizing themselves in this huge, one of the biggest meatpacking plants in the country, and organizing themselves and doing that. And she had to acknowledge, well, I guess they knew what they were doing, blah, blah, blah. But to her, that was an amazing exception. The problem is it can't be an exception if we're going to get people organized. And what I see now in Amazon, and it isn't just the one in New York, there are people organizing themselves. There's this Amazonians United, which doesn't see itself as a traditional trade union, but sees itself as an activist group of workers in Amazon that is organized across the country. They probably won't go for elections in the traditional way, and I don't know, what their bigger plan is. But again, they are organizing actions at Amazon warehouses and winning things, and so they're building power, and that's what matters. And the same thing, Starbucks. We think at first you think that's almost kind of, well, Starbucks, it's all these college kids. Well, it turns out it isn't just university students who are, working in these things at all. That this is a racial workforce, and they are organizing themselves. It's true that they are going into this thing, Workers United, which belongs to the SEIU that you're talking about, and I do worry about that because of that. But nonetheless, they've done this themselves without the help, at least very much help from professional organizers. Now, one of the things you do notice in these struggles, and this is true of almost all of them, not always, but almost all of them, there usually are a handful of socialists there, of people who are consciously political in a left-wing, radical, if not necessarily revolutionary way. And they play an important role in this. Not alone, it's not just like socialists leading people, or something like that, but they do play a role in it. And that's a good sign. Now, if what I would say to the DSA is, well, okay, your organization has hit the wall, it's beginning to shrink, you're losing people, it's having internal fights, it's insisting on running the party, and if they do win, it's the upward and downward dynamic that happens to them. And here's an obvious alternative right now. It's not you have to wait for some big upsurge to come. You have things you can do right now, So turn your organization that, and that in a way is what I was trying to get at, in the book, without necessarily addressing the DSA per se in that specific a way, but that the future of socialism in the United States, and probably anywhere for that matter, really lies in building that kind of rank and file power and activism, particularly in the workplace and in the unions, but also in the social movements, and that's another problem, because the social movements in the US have become, where we get these enormous explosions for a very short period of time, like Occupy, several years ago, or Black Lives Matter. And then it goes away. And what happened, the leaders step in and set up an NGO. And then it becomes a fundraising operation, and then it's a lobbying operation. It becomes conservative. in an active sense. I mean, the political line or what they're saying their goals are is right and all that. The methods change, and that's one of the problems that's happened, in the last couple of years, really, or last few years, depending on which movement we're talking about, is this NGO thing. And now the NGOs themselves are in crisis because they're not getting anywhere, right? You can't get your legislation passed anywhere. The lobbying group,
Yeah.
got that. So, it's a problem. As with ESA, as with the unions, you need to return to grassroots direct action, mass action as the way forward to break this impasse. That's kind of the basic whole point of the book, really.
That's brilliant, and kind of finally, if we look at struggle being at the heart of the antidote, the word you use, I think quite rightly, struggle absolutely central, but also in terms of organisation is take two kind of points together. The essential the point of addressing the issues of racism and that of oppressed groups and supporting self-organisation, but also linked to that in terms of for socialists is building organisation based on self-activity but independent in the independent or socialist organisation as well. Should we end on that? Sorry,
this is something that's always been part of my politics, and I imagine yours. Is the independence of the working class movements and the social movements, the movements of the oppressed, from bourgeois politics. That it means organizational independence, but it also means political ideological independence, and that ultimately means trying to break, from the idea that capital forever, and beginning to challenge things in a way, whether it's directly or through transitional ideas or, whatever particular thing in the moment, and seeing that as part of a broader thing. And that another difficulty in the current situation is that a lot of the different social movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter or immigration rights or climate change, they're different. And, obviously, it doesn't mean that people who are involved in them don't work in more than one of them. They might well, but they overlap, but they don't yet have any obvious way to become part of the united, political mass movement. And that, I think, is a problem. So that's part of the problem. One of the things I just want to end with two things that towards the end of the book. And one is that if the movement is going to use electoralism, electoral politics as a way to bring together union activists and rank and file movements and unions and social movements and climate change and Black Lives Matter and so forth, it has to do that outside the old party structures. Now, the big argument against that in the US has always been, well, it's the first past the post system means a two-party system, and that's just the way it is. And well, okay, there was a certain power to that. You have that problem in the UK to some extent. But, although less so interesting, the Scottish thing and so forth, show that you don't necessarily have to be stuck in the two parties. Not that that's example that I'm putting forward or anything, but just as a way of looking at the fact that the first past the post thing doesn't necessarily dictate everything. But what's happened in the United States as the two parties have redistricted the election districts at both state and the national congressional elections, you now have a situation in which a majority of these districts are one-party districts. And so, you know, it means that Democrats in over 100 districts, congressional districts, and many more in state legislative districts, are running on elections with 70 or 80% of the vote, and the Republican hardly exists, you know, and hardly anyone votes Republican. What that means is the old spoiler argument about, you know, why you can't run a third party candidate because the lesser evil, the bigger evil will win, so you have to vote for the lesser evil, i.e. the Democrat. Well, in the majority of districts, this is no longer the case. You could run a workers' candidate, a radical workers' candidate, or a socialist candidate as an independent or as part of a new party, take them on, and there is no spoiler thing. You either you win or you don't win, but first time out or whatever. But you know, it's actually changed the political system of the United States in a way that most people didn't notice until very recently. But now it's very clear. There's only about 30 districts out of 435 congressional districts that are actually competitive between the two parties, which is one reason why the Democrats have a hard time getting a majority, because they're stuck in these big urban districts and so forth. But from our point of view, well, that means we can run against Democrats, and it doesn't mean a Republican's going to win, because the numbers, the math is very clear about that. So that opens future possibilities. I'm not saying that's what we should do right now, but it opens future possibilities. And then there's a concluding note at the end, in which I say, well, okay, let's look at what underlies this debate between those of us who are saying electoralism in the Democratic Party isn't going to work, and those who are saying that it might. And that is that we're actually looking at something more fundamental, and that is, you can say you're socialist, you know, and all of that, but there is this question of the revolutionary overthrow of the system, and you know, that is what underlies the. Do you see the, you know, I use the sort of facetious idea of, well, is socialism going to really be imposed by the U.S. Congress voting in favor of it and the President of the United States ratifying it? I don't think so. It isn't the way it's going to happen at all. And we can argue about how it might happen, but that isn't the way. It's going to be an upsurge, you know, with people taking over their workplace, taking over industry and so forth, you know, through democratic means that they create, you know, maybe workers' councils. We don't know exactly what it would be, but that kind of, and that is what I think the problem with DSA is, that there isn't there's an attempt by the leaders of, I think, really the majority tendencies to say that you can actually achieve socialism step by step through, you know, social democratic reforms, or they might not use that term, but that way. So what I'm saying is that no, ultimately, not only can you not break the impasse without having a mass upsurge, but the idea of socialism legislated through the U.S. Congress or some state legislature or something like that is an absurdity, and it will happen in a different way, even if we don't know exactly what that would be.
That's brilliant, Kim. And just to remind people, please do read Kim's new book, Breaking the Impasse, available now. But I do recommend that it's read in conjunction with Kim's previous book on New Terrain. I think the two complement each other fantastically. Once again, thank you, Kim.
Okay, thank you. All right.